Today on the show we talk about exposure. Yes. So what is exposure and why is it important? Exposure is how you determine how much brightness your image is accumulating, right? If you have too much light, too much intensity going on from your light sources, your image will be blown out in white, especially parts that are actually white. But then at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, too little of exposure and you don't have a very vivid image. So therefore your image is really dull and boring and bleh. Not to mention you will have a lot of artifacting going on there. Just a quick tip, artifacting is when you have too little light and you need to bump up the ISO, which I'll talk about in just a second, and then you start having artifacts in your image and it looks really, really ugly. So what controls the exposure? The exposure is controlled by three different components: shutter speed, aperture, which is controlled by the iris, and ISO. ISO stands for International Standard Organization. I don't know why that's what it stands for, it just does. Deal with it. And it's also called gain. Now when you're controlling your exposure, think of it in a big old triangle. So what it is, on this triangle, on each corner you have shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now if you want to pull one in one direction, you have to adjust the other two to make sure it works. Now how do you measure exposure? On all cameras you will find a little meter at the bottom, which usually is from -3 to +3 with the 0 in the middle. For example, on my GH4 right now, before I set up the shot, I did make sure that my exposure is set properly. Just my personal preference, whenever I do filming, I always underexpose just a little bit so that in post-production, I can bring up those levels back up and get those details in the image. Another great tool that all cameras should have is something called Zebra. Now, if you're a lower end DSLR user, you will not have this unless you hack your camera from the Canon Rebel series, for example, like I've mentioned before. If you have Magic Lantern or something like that installed, you can enable this feature. And this feature is called the Zebra. Now, what is Zebra? It looks exactly as it sounds. So basically, if your image is overexposed, you will start seeing some zebra lines going across that area of the frame where it's overexposed. Of course, when it's underexposed, you can't tell, you just have to eye that. But it is a very useful tool to make sure your whole composition, your whole image is well lit and not overexposed. Now, you may do it deliberately. You may want to have a light source in your shot and you want it to be booming with light. That's up to your discretion. However, it is not easy on the eyes for a viewer to watch. Just keep that in mind. But let's say, for example, you want to have a really wide aperture, so you're allowing all that light to go in, let's say at a 1.8 or even a 1.2, all right? And then your shutter speed, which should be set at double the amount of frame rates that you're filming at. So for example, if you're filming at 24 frames a second, you should ideally put your shutter speed at 48. If you can't, then at least the closest number. So most lower end DSLRs, even my GH4, which I consider to be a professional grade camera, you losers out there, it's actually at the shutter speed of 1/50th, right? So 1/50, but you'll just see 50 in the bottom corner. And your ISO is all the way down to, like, you know, values of 100, 200, but your image is still overexposed. There's one great tool that you can use to attach to your camera. Some cameras even have them built in, which is called the ND filter. What is an ND filter? ND filter is a neutral density filter, right? This basically allows you to balance your image at different levels. The one I actually bought, which helped me save cost, and it's kind of a all-around kind of tool, is a variable ND filter. So this way you have different thicknesses to help you with your exposure compensation, right? Say your image is like really, really bright, you slap this thing on, you adjust your ND filter to make sure that it's not overexposed, and bam, you have a great looking image. Now I briefly want to talk about ISO, also known as gain, just really quickly. Whenever you're filming, you want to keep it as low as possible, whatever situation you are in. If you need to add more lights, even if it's really, really dark. Try to add as many lights as possible. And then when all else fails and your image is still really, really dark, then go ahead and bump up the ISO. But be careful that some cameras cannot perform really well in low light. I know the new line of Sonys that are coming out are extremely well in low light situations. So you could, consider getting those kind of cameras if you want to primarily shoot in low light. Me personally, if I was to get an all-around camera, I use the Panasonic GH4. This is not a sponsored video. But as I was saying, if you need to bump up your ISO, do so, but be very, very cautious about it. Please do not get past 800 or even 1600, because then it starts getting really, really ugly and really, really grainy. Well, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it and learned something, make sure you hit that like button. And if you want to make sure you keep up with all the other episodes, make sure you subscribe and be sure to check out all the other previous videos if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.